My name's Sarah Lyons. I'm the Chief Operating Officer at Privacy Analytics, based in Ottawa, working with Khaled. And I've also had the pleasure and privilege of working with Adrian and Sarana on the journeys that they've described. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about data sharing and de-identification platforms in practice, taking a little bit more of a commercial lens to some of the business drivers, challenges, and solutions available for de-identification, for data sharing, for third-party access to de-identified data, along with some of the industry trends that we're seeing. So often the real driver here is to generate economic benefit from data that's available. So this can be in the form of products that are based on real-world data. It can be in the form of analytics, reports such as benchmarks. It can be in the form of direct commercialization of the data itself. But very often the driver for our de-identification, for data sharing platform is revenue, is monetary from a commercial standpoint. And this is what often makes the business case for investing in such a platform. Now, the challenge in looking at many of the opportunities to derive economic benefit from data is that one needs the legal authority to use and disclose data for a particular purpose. And many times these opportunities, whether it be a product or an analytics offering or commercialization of the data, is in a context that is net new and not what the data was originally collected for. And in many cases, consent is no longer feasible. So the legal authority to use this data in this particular way may not exist. And de-identification, and in the terminology introduced, full anonymization is required. It's an imperative. There are also scenarios where maybe the legal authorities do exist to use the data in this particular way, but de-identification is applied to further mitigate risk, so a risk mitigation technique. And this poses an important question and challenge is, how do you actually de-identify data effectively and still achieve that ultimate value that's desired? So how do you preserve the utility while ensuring that no individual or patient can be identified in the data, that it truly is fully de-identified or anonymized so that it can be used in this way? So I'll talk a little bit about some of the solutions in practice. And there are very sophisticated de-identification methods available that can be applied, but in practice, for this to be practical for many of the applications that are seen, the solutions need to be efficient and scalable and implementable. So there's two general platforms that we see for de-identifying personally identifiable data. One is for data feeds, so feeds of data from point A to point B. And then the second is for discrete data sets. So we'll look at both types and just explore some of the actual applications in practice. So data feeds. There's different scenarios for how a particular data feed might be de-identified and different setups for different contexts. So one is de-identification at source. So if the feed is for data moving from point A to point B, the data is actually de-identified at the source or point A. And I'll share a few examples of real-world examples here. The second is where there's a trusted third party used to de-identify data feeds. So data from point A arrives at a trusted third party to be de-identified before continuing on to point B. The third is a bit of a variant where there's a demilitarized zone within point B where that data or those data feeds are de-identified. And then the last example here is where within an organization there's pseudonymization applied, that's that word, but de-identification used internal to an organization to be able to use data, link data in different ways that are fully de-identified or fully anonymized. And in the examples that I'm going to share, I'm using the term de-identified, but to marry with the terminology that Rihanna introduced, really meaning fully anonymized in these examples, unless otherwise stated. So if you remember the visual that Khaled shared at the beginning, where there was sort of that line to distinguish between partially de-identified and sort of fully anonymized. Most of these examples are fully anonymized, assuming that the legal authority to use or disclose personally identifiable data does not exist. Okay, so this is an example of data feeds that are basically being pulled, aggregated for research and researcher accessibility to perform particular studies. And this could be in a healthcare example, clinics where there's de-identification capability and software implemented at the clinic, at source, before that data feed is passed onward. And so the data is fully de-identified, fully anonymized, so that it can be used for research purposes. And I'll share an example of electronic medical record data feed scenario that has actually been in place now for many, many years, where approximately, over 2,500 clinics have de-identification applied at the clinic for electronic medical record data, covering about 500,000 patients. And by de-identifying the data and then making it available for analysts in a fully de-identified form, prescription pattern analysis can be applied and performed, post-marketing surveillance of adverse effects can be performed. And so this is a real example that's been running for many years. And as a result, there's been a lot of quantifiable value derived from the data in a way that has protected patient privacy right at source, right at the clinic level. So the solution's fully integrated with the data extraction capability. So this is an example of an at-source de-identification platform. And the second one here is this concept of a trusted third party. And actually, as Privacy Analytics, we've played the role of a trusted third party. An example in practice, again, within the healthcare industry is working with clinics that prescribe a metabolic syndrome drug. That data is then fed, data feeds into the trusted third party secure zone to be linked and fully de-identified before being made available to study and answer certain study questions about the drug in practice. So this is the trusted third party, and this is sort of the concept. This could also be for pharmacy data feeds. So different data feeds across different pharmacies coming into a trusted third party so that the data can be linked but also fully de-identified before being made available to an analytics provider who can derive new insights from that data. Now, the third example here was this concept of a demilitarized zone, and very similar, But rather than using a trusted third party, so a separate entity to de-identify the data, in this case, there's actually a segregated, sort of secured, demilitarized zone within the organization receiving the data, so the analytics provider in this case, where the data is de-identified before being made available to analysts within the organization itself. So very similar, but different entities involved. And then the last example for data feeds is actually within an organization, and this could be different departments. Data is pseudonymized, and I'll just maybe pause there and describe what I'm referring to. So data is de-identified, but direct identifiers, and that could be something like a social insurance number or a health card number, are masked with pseudonyms that preserve the ability to link on that particular data element. So one SIN number is always mapped to the same pseudonym to enable linking. And many times this is done not because full de-identification is necessarily required. There might be the legal authority to actually use the data, but the pseudonymization is applied to mitigate the risk, because having these data elements exposed within the organization creates a higher risk if something were to happen. So by encrypting the values but still allowing for the analysis to be done, the risk associated with privacy is mitigated. And to manage this, because it is encryption, there's often centrally governance over the overall solution, key management, and other things that go into place depending on the actual implementation. So these are all examples of data feeds where data is sort of moving from point A to point B, maybe onward to point C, and there's de-identification applied along that sort of chain. And the second general category is where we have an actual data set. So this could be a database or an extract from a database, but a data set that's desired for a particular purpose. And often the applications or the use cases are to make data available to researchers, but there's also examples of making data available through, for example, a third-party portal or secure sandbox, or even online analytics tools, which we've seen available through license with telco companies and others that make fully de-identified data available through different analytics tools and offerings. And there's actually different flavors of what this looks like practically in terms of implementation, depending on whether one is dealing with a small number of data sets that are continually de-identified for different uses, different recipients, or whether there's actually a very high number of different types of data sets that need to be de-identified for different recipients and different uses. So as an example, we've worked with the birth registry in Ontario, and that's sort of a single registry, and there are a lot of requests for access to de-identified birth registry data for research purposes. That would be maybe more homogeneous as an example, so sort of a single data set or a single database being de-identified for different recipients, versus a scenario that we see often with clinical trials data, where there's actually many sort of smaller data sets that are desired for different studies or different research applications. So whatever the de-identification solution in place is, it should be able to accommodate the type of data that is needed to serve the variety of purposes that are desired. So this is an example of, just in a generalized way, what a discrete de-identification solution could look like. So within a given organization, there might be, a series of information systems and data repositories. And in this example, there's sort of a centralized analytics service that de-identifies the data, potentially first links data across data sets. That's often where a lot of value is acquired. But then once the data is linked, the de-identification has to account for making sure that the ultimate risk is within that threshold that we've been talking about. And then the de-identified data can be made available to external researchers or recipients or consumers of the data through a portal. Can also be made available to internal analysts. Maybe there's information sharing initiatives between departments. So there might be multiple different use cases for how those de-identified data sets are made available and applied in practice. And I'll shift gears to a real-life example here from the American Society of Clinical Oncology. And actually, ASCO said something that stuck with me about what they're trying to do. They said, if we only make decisions based on study data, we only account for 3% of the population receiving cancer treatment. And if we really want our treatment to address the whole population of patients, we need to reach the other 97% of people receiving care. So this is kind of getting at the core of really the desire to leverage all real-world data. But de-identification, of course, is needed to be able to achieve such a goal. Consent is not generally practical, and effective de-identification is needed. And so ASCO takes EMR data and de-identifies it, and then makes that data available through CancerLink portal. They also accommodate specialized requests for data. So their CancerLink portal really enables some access to rich data for analyses that ultimately are designed to improve cancer care and patient outcomes over time. Now, we've talked about the concept of risk, re-identification risk, and how context is paramount to this overall discussion. And this is very important in the examples given of discrete data set de-identification, because the context can change. There might be different recipients, different data consumers, different researchers, internal, external. We've heard some examples. And so with the context change, the data often needs to be perturbed differently to ensure that the overall risk is within an acceptable threshold. And this is paramount. This is kind of what we call a risk-based approach to de-identification. The context is essential. Is the data being released out into the public, or is the data being highly controlled in a secure sandbox with terms of use, very strong privacy and security controls? Those two contexts are very different, and the threat profile is different. So in all cases, the context has to be understood, and risk needs to be measured in a defensible way. So in these examples of discrete data sets, whatever the platform solution is, there has to be a mechanism to account for the different contexts in which data is being released and used. Now, the lower the risk context, the more data utility can be preserved. So if you have a very, very, very high risk context, so less privacy and security controls, less contractual controls, then the data has to be perturbed a lot to achieve that risk threshold. And for many of the applications that we talk about, a high data utility is desired. So ultimately, one wants the context risk to be low. And one way to achieve this goal in practice is to really control the context. So where the contractual controls can be really enforced, where privacy and security controls can be really enforced, and where these can be made constant and consistent, then data utility can be preserved. So this is an example, and there's others out in industry. This is a privacy analytics workbench where the concept is to make the de-identified data available only within a secure, locked down sandbox with strict terms of use. So the data utility is very high, but the context risk is managed through this secured environment. And the example here, where this is often used in practice, is with clinical trial individual patient data, study data. Sponsors can load de-identified data with the aim of promoting transparency, where there's a big push for clinical trials transparency, so they want to make the study data available for research and in the frame of transparency goals. So life sciences sponsors can upload the de-identified data, which can be then made available in an analytics workspace, accessed through a virtualized environment by researchers who have their own virtual machine, who can work with the data within that environment, even link with other de-identified data that they have, but they cannot extract the data. The data remains in the secured environment, and the terms of use are defined and fixed. And they might derive results or insights, but the data stays where it is within that secure sandbox. So this is an example of where the context risk can be minimized to keep the data utility as high as possible while still ensuring that the data is de-identified. Okay, so moving to general industry direction and trends, what are some of the methods for de-identifying? We focused on platforms and some practical solutions that we've seen in real use cases. So there's different methods of de-identifying data, and we've talked a lot about the risk-based de-identification methodology, which is basically accounting for context, which is predicated on measuring risk statistically, defensibly. And at the beginning, Khaled showed different standards and guidelines that exist all over the world. Those actually are consistent and adopt sort of this risk-based method in the guidance that they provide. So I think some of the examples were the UK, ICO, Ontario, the European Medicines Agency, there's many others. And so this tends to be, the risk-based methodology tends to be the most tested and used in practice. It's where the industry has continued to shift, where a lot of the standards and guidelines are trending, and what has been shared in many of the examples that we've seen today. Other methods include creating synthetic data. And so this is actually where the raw personally identifiable data is used to create a purely synthetic data set that mirrors or properly represents the relationships between data elements, the correlations that existed within the original data set. So this can be a little bit hard to do for a very high number of different data elements, complex relationships, and the method hasn't been highly adopted in certain industries. So in healthcare, in general, a lot of the individuals and professionals that do the research and analysis, epidemiologists, biostatisticians, often won't use synthetic data for their studies. But it is one method of protecting privacy. In practice, you really need to understand how the data will be used to create synthetic data that's usable. So that's one. The other one, which has actually been quite well recognized more recently, is differential privacy. And the idea with differential privacy is largely to mitigate the privacy impact to individuals by addressing or minimizing attribute disclosure, so characteristics about individuals. And there's a couple of questions and issues around differential privacy because it addresses attribute disclosure, but it doesn't actually prevent or address identity disclosure, which is what the legal frameworks tend to be focused on. Is, personally identifiable data is data that can identify me or you, and differential privacy is not so much focused on preventing identifying an individual, but more so attributes. So there's sort of a question there about how compatible it is with some of the legal frameworks. But the second issue that I think is still being resolved around differential privacy is the methods used are generally, in sort of simplistic terms, to kind of add noise to the data, and there hasn't been general consensus around some of the parameters for adding noise. And there are some examples where parameters, or epsilon in this case, was selected in a way that actually privacy wasn't protected in the way that it thought it was, that the entity applying the method thought that they had protected privacy. So there's still a couple of issues around differential privacy, but certainly the concept does mitigate privacy risk, just in a different way than preventing the disclosure of an individual's identity by de-identifying the data. So it's sort of different in concept fundamentally. So what are some of the issues facing a lot of organizations that are looking to derive value from data and looking to de-identify that data to make this possible? One is the rising demands over time associated with data complexity. And so the increases in data complexity come in many different flavors. One is very large data sets, longitudinal data sets, where there are many events or records pertaining to each individual that's in the data set, but also data sets that are quite complex in the number of variables or data elements. So many different tables, many different data elements. We're regularly working with data sets that have over 4,000 indirectly identifying data elements. So this is one area in which data complexity is growing. The other is the continued drive towards linking data sets to achieve greater value. And so in some cases, this includes very different types of data, so financial data and health data as an example. And I think we talked a little bit about this, but when data sets are linked, the risk of re-identification can change. So the resultant linked data set needs to be de-identified and ensured that it's within an acceptable risk threshold. So often it's very different types of data coming together, and knowledge, expertise, methods that account for those types of data without eroding their utility need to be applied. And then just the velocity. So data sets are continuously being updated. They're not static. It's not you do it one time and then you're done. The value is realized as data sets are continuously updated and new value, new insight can be achieved. So all these contributors to data complexity really create the need and the demand for very efficient and practical solutions that can scale and that can accommodate the need while protecting privacy and preserving the usefulness of the data. And so that brings me to this concept of governance, which I think has actually been raised several times as critically important. And there are challenges that are really demanding strong de-identification governance as essential to an overall solution. And this spans, people, process, technology, as Sarana described. But linked data, we've talked about, there's risks with linking data, there's also value, so how do you deal with data linkages properly? Very different data consumers and different risk profiles. Not all recipients are necessarily the same in terms of risk profile. We've heard that as well. Different categories of data consumers, commercial data consumers, academic, not-for-profit or government, and different security environments in which data is being accessed or used. There's also the need to consider how to oversee the consumers of the de-identified data, to audit, to validate that the terms of use are being applied in practice. And increasingly, particularly relevant for multinationals, data is being pooled from multiple jurisdictions. And so there's a need to address regulatory requirements across jurisdictions, which aren't necessarily the same. And so a holistic and a complete governance framework for dealing with these types of scenarios is absolutely critical. With this trend, there's an increasing expectation that organizations apply consistency and standardization in how they de-identify data. Might be very different use cases, very different recipients, very different data, and so different recipes are applied depending on the context and the use, but the methodology, the way in which that recipe is generated has to be consistent, has to be standardized. Otherwise, this gets very difficult to govern, very difficult to defend. And so there's an increased sort of trend towards having a global governance framework that applies consistency and often this concept of risk-based approach. So even though the context changes, there's still the standard method for measuring risk and for ensuring that the de-identified data set has a re-identification risk within the acceptable threshold. So I'll stop there and see if there are any questions.